The second part of this notes, we'll just pick up right where we left off. I might have a 15-minute timer, so I knew I was going to pass that with these. This is finishing, just so you know, they're right after the oxygen cycle. So carbon cycle, this is the fall and the flow of carbon, a major element in our world through different environments. Carbon is essential for living organic compounds, right? So these things that are necessary for life, carbohydrates, proteins, fats. One, we've already seen carbon at work in glucose, what plants make their own simple sugar. That if you remember the formula, it was C6H12O6, but that C is carbon. That's a carbon element. So carbon flows through the atmosphere. Normally through here, we get that through cellular respiration. It's kind of put off CO2. Also burning of things enters carbon into the atmosphere. Plants producers use carbon during the process of photosynthesis. It may be eaten by consumers and then kind of pass through a food web, which then enters out into the atmosphere, or it can even enter into the ground. So as this tree dies, or as this rabbit or this bobcat both die, they get broken down in the soil. Microbes, little bacteria and things, detritivores, they start tearing them apart. They start breaking it down into the simple parts, one of which is going to be carbon. At that point, it can be reused. Maybe it's used as fertilizer for this tree, or maybe it's passed up through the atmosphere as bacteria release it as gases or through cellular respiration. Anyway, this carbon flows in and out. It does it without even noticing. The simplest transfer is just very easy to think about, just like the oxygen cycle between photosynthesis and cellular respiration in plants and animals accordingly. And these are just some other pictures of the carbon cycle. Next, we have the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen, one of the most abundant elements on Earth. Nitrogen is used in all kinds of living things, plants, animals, whatever you have, bacteria. This is I believe you have this chart, and it's kind of a little different colored, so you might have a little difficulty reading it. But one thing that we can see here, there's nitrogen in the atmosphere. A large portion of our atmosphere is nitrogen. The problem is that animals and plants can't really use this nitrogen in a gas form. So it enters into nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which are found in the roots of a lot of plants, so right in the soil, right? So nitrogen in the atmosphere gets absorbed into these bacteria, and you can see this little chart we're about to talk about. Then it gets used, turned into ammonium, nitrifying bacteria, and all this kind of stuff. Let's just look at our stuff, our notes. Organisms need nitrogen to live. Like I said a minute ago, most organisms can't use nitrogen the way it is naturally. So it has to be fixed, as we call it. And the whole nitrogen cycle is all about that, transforming nitrogen gas into usable forms of nitrogen. Excuse me. Nitrogen gas can be changed to ammonia by these bacteria. And this process that they do this by is called nitrogen fixation, right? So let's look back at our chart. We mentioned nitrogen in the atmosphere. The bacteria take it in. They fix it, changing it into this compound called ammonium. This compound called ammonium. We also can get nitrogen that's already in plants and animals as they decompose, as they die and begin rotting away. This is called ammonification. That becomes ammonium, which can be found in the soil. Much of the nitrogen cycle, the working parts of it at least, takes place underground. And after nitrogen fixation, then a different type of bacteria comes in and changes ammonia into ammonium, which ammonium can be used by producers to make their own food. Then, just like we saw with that picture of the carbon cycle, nitrogen's passed all along the food web. So if I eat some type of plant that's rich in nitrogen, that nitrogen is usable in my body. Okay? And then if some shark eats me, that's not going to happen because I don't swim in the ocean very much, if at all. But anyway, if that shark eats me, it gets nitrogen from eating poor old Coach Hicks. So it goes through the food web. Eventually, though, the nitrogen gets passed back into the ground. How does it do that? By things dying, decomposers. And the nitrogen that's found in the soil, How does it get back to the atmosphere? Remember, everything's a cycle. Everything's going to be cyclical. Everything's going to go around, comes around, goes around, right? The law of conservation of matter tells us things just don't get destroyed. It's got to change into something. So this nitrogen that's found in the soil, how does it get back to the atmosphere? There's another type of bacteria, that's right, called denitrifying bacteria. And this changes something called nitrates back into nitrogen gas, which is found in the atmosphere. So it's released back into it. This is a wonderful little chart, just how you can see all the different parts of it. I'm not going to be nitpicky about nitrates and nitrites and stuff like that. I just want you to see that most of it takes place underground. And the major player in the nitrogen cycle is bacteria. Not a little squirrel. Sorry, bud. It's bacteria. They are the ones that fix nitrogen and also denitrify it. And our final cycle of matter is the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is another element. This cycle, what's so unique about it, is that it takes a very, 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 very long time. Okay? I mean, very long time. Some of it's been going on since the beginning of the world, and it's still happening now, that we're still waiting on it to happen. The phosphorus cycle is how phosphorus gets returned to the environment. Now, phosphorus is oftentimes overlooked, but it's actually very important in plant growth. Okay, we use phosphorus as well. It's something that if you look at the ingredients in your food or the nutritional facts, you'll see phosphorus on there. But plants use it much more. This is a good little picture of phosphorus. Unlike the other cycles, which you saw with the like water cycle and the oxygen and carbon cycle, most of it takes place in the atmosphere, right? Or a large chunk of it takes place in the atmosphere. And then nitrogen, it takes place underground. The phosphorus cycle mostly takes place at ground level. So it's what's happening here on Earth. Phosphate is released by the slow breakdown of rocks. That's right. You heard that right. As mountains, as cliffs, as boulders, as rocks sitting in our yard gets broken down by erosion, water and wind running over them and slowly and steadily pulling away particles of them, phosphates are released. Producers then take up the phosphates and they use them to create their own energy. Then, much like we've seen in some other stuff, they're taken into the food web and passed around and around and around, right? The celery is made a producer. The rabbit eats the celery. The bobcat eats the rabbit. That kind of thing. So it's passed through the food web all while we're getting phosphorus. Okay? But it all started with the slow breakdown of rocks. Now, here's what takes so long. We have to, in a cycle, it has to get back to where it was, right? So what begins to happen, or has been happening since the beginning of time, when dead organisms break down by decomposers, phosphorus gets released back into the environment. It's released back in the world, into the soil. So what happens? It begins to set up sediments, including phosphorus sediments, build up over time, a very long period of time to form new rock formations. So for the last hundreds of thousands of years, this phosphorus that's getting run off from rocks eventually comes back to be rocks, comes back to be stone. This one is a cycle that oftentimes is overlooked because of how long it takes. The other one's easy to think about. Oxygen, I breathe it out, or I breathe it in. The producers pump it out. Phosphorus was a rock. It erodes. It gets used by plants, and the plants go through the food web. It gets decomposed, and eventually it turns into sediment, which then sediment sets on sediment on sediment on sediment until it starts to form new rock formations. I think this is a really good look at that. Excuse me. How weathering, like erosion, produces phosphate. This goes into the soil. It may go into the water. Okay, and eventually this phosphate gets built up on itself over time. It's something called geologic uplifting. Eventually we get stone. We get rocks. We get mountains even out of that. It just takes a very, very long period of time. Feel free to use these notes as well as the video before to go ahead and answer your quiz. You'll also use these notes to work on a little project later this week.